Have you ever stopped to think about how a whole society could, well, sort of drift away from freedom, almost without noticing?
Mm-hmm.
It's this big concern, right? And maybe feels more relevant now than ever.
Yeah, definitely.
So today we're diving deep into that question, but maybe from an angle you wouldn't expect. We're looking at it through this historical, even biblical lens.
That's right.
We're using a really interesting piece by Joe Brown over at Heresy Financial. It's called How Nations Fall from Freedom to Tyranny, a Biblical Blueprint.
Yeah, Brown's analysis is pretty compelling. He digs deep into Genesis 57 and the Exodus story.
Right.
And it's fascinating how he pulls out these insights about societal decline from those ancient narratives, things about, human nature and power structures that still feel very real.
Absolutely. So our mission here today is to unpack this ancient blueprint he lays out. We want to see what it suggests about that path from liberty to, well, oppression.
Yeah.
And crucially, connected to how you might spot these patterns today, maybe even figure out how to navigate them. It's quite a journey he maps out.
It really is.
Okay, so let's start with the core teaching Brown pulls out. It takes us right back to that story of Joseph in Egypt.
Yeah.
You can probably remember it. Pharaoh has that intense dream.
Yeah, the 7 fat cows, 7 lean cows.
Exactly. And Joseph interprets it. 7 years of incredible abundance, just rolling in grain, followed by 7 years of just devastating famine.
And Joseph's advice then was crucial. He tells Pharaoh, okay, during these good years, you've got to store up grain. Like, seriously store it up.
Right, prepare.
But the really unsettling part, and this is what Brown focuses on, is what happened when that famine actually hit, how the Egyptian people reacted. It wasn't immediate collapse. It was this 4-step descent.
Okay.
First, as things got tough, they exchanged all their money for the grain Pharaoh had stored, just handed over their cash.
Okay, money first.
Then, when the money ran out, they traded their livestock, their productive animals, their capital in a sense.
Wow. So assets next.
Exactly. After that, things got even worse. They had to sell their land itself, their homes, their fields.
Their means of production.
Pretty much everything. And the final step, when there was absolutely nothing left, they sold themselves into slavery just to get food, just to survive.
That's chilling. I mean, Egypt basically transforms, right, the state. Pharaoh ends up owning everything, their assets, the land, even the people themselves.
Total consolidation of power and wealth.
But Brown points out this really interesting exception, the one group that didn't follow this path, the priests.
Ah, yes.
They kept their land. Pharaoh actually gave them a direct ration, supported them outside this whole system of surrender. It's quite a detail.
It really is. And that's central to the takeaway Brown emphasizes. He argues the population's failure, their lack of personal responsibility during those years of plenty.
The good years.
Yeah. The good years, that failure led directly to their total dependence on the state when the crisis finally hit. It wasn't just bad luck. It was a consequence of inaction. And this isn't just some old story for Brown. This is where he develops his whole tyranny blueprint. It's about a fundamental vulnerability, he argues.
That 4-step process is really stark when you lay it out like that. Money, livestock, land, self. It shows how a crisis can just strip people bare.
Right.
But Brown argues this isn't just a one-off event in history. He says it's a pattern, right?
Yeah.
A repeatable tyranny blueprint.
Exactly. He sees the Egyptian story as a template. He boils it down into this clear, almost predictable progression.
Okay, so what are the steps in his blueprint?
Well, step 1, according to Brown, is the abandonment of responsibility. People basically put their trust in the government's preparations, Pharaoh storing grain, instead of saving or preparing themselves.
Okay, outsourcing responsibility.
Yeah. And that directly leads to step 2, the loss of money. Wealth is the easiest thing to give up first when you need something urgently, like food.
Makes sense.
Step 3 is the loss of property, specifically productive assets, giving up your livestock, your tools, the things that let you create wealth.
So you lose your independence.
Precisely. Which brings us to step 4, the loss of freedom. Ultimately, bodily autonomy is surrendered, slavery in the biblical context, becoming dependent subjects.
And then there's that final point about the priests.
Right. Step 5, power consolidation by the politically connected. Brown highlights that the priests, the insiders, were spared. They kept their land, got their rations. It shows how those close to power often weather the storm or even benefit when society breaks down.
That's a pretty bleak picture.
It is. And Brown connects it directly to modern times, too. He specifically mentions taxation.
Oh,
How so?
Well, he points out that tax rates, often hovering around 20% or even higher in many places, are kind of reminiscent of that one-fifth tribute Pharaoh eventually imposed.
Ah, the 20% Joseph set up after the famine.
Exactly. Brown's point isn't just about the number itself, but the psychological shift. When a big chunk of your effort automatically goes to the state, he argues, it can foster dependence, not self-reliance. And he makes this critical observation. Power, once the state gets it, is almost never given back easily. It usually takes some kind of major conflict or upheaval.
That taxation comparison is definitely something to think about. It highlights how power can consolidate subtly. But going back to that first step, the abandonment of responsibility, is Brown saying it's like a deliberate choice people make, or more like a slow drift? Complacency.
Yeah, he leans heavily towards complacency. It's not usually a big conscious decision, more like a gradual shift.
Okay.
He points out how institutions, maybe like churches or even just community groups, historically handled things like charity, helping the needy.
Right, local support systems.
Exactly. And over time, he argues, many of those responsibilities have been sort of outsourced to government programs, welfare, social safety nets. It's a shift in expectation.
As is.
And individually, he observes that many of us today tend to consume more than we produce, or maybe just trust that the system, pensions, Social Security, whatever, will be there for us in an emergency. Less focus on building personal resilience.
So less personal saving, less preparation.
That's the idea he puts forward. And the result, Brown warns, is this growing dependence. And dependence, over the long haul, chips away at individual freedom. He draws that direct, stark parallel. Just like the Israelites eventually became slaves in Egypt, maybe through a slow process they barely noticed.
Yeah.
He warns that modern populations risk a similar fate through this kind of complacency, this offloading of personal duties. It's a pretty strong warning.
It definitely makes you pause. And Brown has those two phrases that really stick, don't they? They capture his whole argument.
Yeah, the aphorisms. Powerful stuff.
There are no handouts without handcuffs. And there are no rights without responsibilities.
Exactly. He really hammers that link. Responsibility and freedom are two sides of the same coin. You can't really have one without the other, in his view.
So giving up responsibility means you're essentially giving up freedom, whether it's financial responsibility, moral responsibility, taking care of your community. When individuals or societies step back, Brown argues, it creates this vacuum.
And something else steps in.
Authoritarian systems, or just bigger government control, tends to fill that space. And here's a really fascinating, almost counterintuitive point he brings up from the Exodus story itself.
Okay.
Even after the Israelites escaped slavery, gained their freedom, what do many of them do?
They complain.
They complain. They actually look back almost nostalgically to the perceived security of Egypt, the flesh pots, the guaranteed food, even though it meant slavery. They found the hardship and the responsibility of freedom too difficult.
That's uncomfortable because you can kind of see that tendency, can't you? Wanting the easy path. It's a profound insight into human nature, I think. Freedom is hard work. Responsibility is hard work. Comfort and security, even under oppression, can be seductive.
Okay, so that's the warning, the blueprint for decline. But does Brown offer a path forward, a blueprint for staying free? What's the practical advice here?
Yes, absolutely. He doesn't just diagnose the problem. He offers countermeasures for individuals, things you can do.
Good. What are they?
First, pretty straightforward but crucial. Live below your means. Save during the good times, the times of plenty, just like Joseph advised, but on a personal level. Build your own reserves.
Don't rely on Pharaoh's grain stores.
Exactly. Second, invest and prepare. Don't just save cash, maybe, but develop skills, acquire useful assets, maybe build community ties, things that institutional safety nets can't easily replicate or take away. Be self-sufficient in meaningful ways.
Makes sense. What else?
Third, and this is key, maintain sovereignty. He means this in a broad sense over your life, your finances, your decisions, even your own thinking. Don't just passively accept what systems or authorities hand down. Own your choices.
Okay, personal agency.
Right. And finally, be vigilant. Be aware. Brown warns that threats to freedom often don't look like threats initially. They might come disguised as aid or protection or convenience.
So pay attention to the trade-offs.
Constantly. It's about seeing past the surface level.
And that leads to his final point, doesn't it? About the promised land.
Yeah, that journey to true liberty, the real promised land, isn't about finding a place of ease and comfort that's just given to you.
It's earned.
It demands what Brown calls extreme responsibility. It's an active pursuit, not a passive destination. It belongs to those who refuse to trade their freedom, their autonomy, for an easier life under someone else's control.
It's a powerful call to action, really.
Yeah.
Not just a historical analysis.
Definitely. The core message is unavoidable. Liberty isn't something you just have, it's something you do. It's an active choice every day, and it demands that constant vigilance and responsibility.
So thinking about Brown's blueprint, those steps, those warnings,
Yeah.
it leaves you with a pretty direct question, doesn't it?
Mhm.
For you listening, in what specific areas of your own life might you be, maybe unknowingly, trading a bit of freedom for comfort or convenience? And what would embracing that extreme responsibility actually look like practically in those areas?
That's the challenge he leaves us with.
Something to definitely mull over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into some really powerful and maybe unsettling ideas.